Alrighty, I'm sure we'll have a couple more join us, but we're going to go ahead and get started here with our December Outdoor Florida webinar. This month, we're featuring the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation and joined by our special guest, Jason Lauritsen, who is the Chief Conservation Officer. He's worked in the conservation field for more than 20 years. And most recently, before coming to the foundation, he served as the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary Director for Audubon. He also holds a master's degree in science education from the University of Iowa. At the end of Jason's presentation today, we are going to have some time for questions, so feel free to save those till the end, or go ahead and type them in the chat, and we will have a chance to read them at the end of the webinar. Just a reminder that the presentation today is being recorded, so we will be posting this on the Florida State Parks YouTube page, as well as emailing out the link to that video a couple days after the webinar. And with that, I think we are good to go. Jason, if you want to take it away.
Absolutely. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And we can get started. And first, I just want to thank the Office of Greenways and Trails for putting on this great seminar series. And the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation is thrilled to be a part of it. We see partnering as the only way we're going to actually save the corridor. So having partners like the FDEP and the Office of Greenways and Trails is critical really to getting across the finish line. My hope here today is that you all will find a little bit deeper appreciation for the state that we live in and the natural resources that are a part of our backyard, and the value not only that it brings to you, but that it brings to others in the community that we share it with. And also that you can just increase your enthusiasm for joining us in an effort to conserve it and to help us plan a roadmap to making some of the tough decisions, because it's, our state is seeing an increase in people moving here. And as a result of that, it puts pressure on our natural resources. And we have to race against the clock to see which pieces we can save and put our energy into, and what questions are the most important for us to try to solve and answer. So I appreciate you sticking with us here on this little journey, and look forward to questions at the end. Just right off the bat, I wanted to share this picture of my kids. They're a little older now. This was several years ago at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, and it's a reminder to me as one of the reasons why I do this and why I think we probably all do this. We want to make sure that when we look back, what we leave future generations is as good, if not better, than what we have when we were growing up. And so stewardship is a theme for me. And so anyway, I hope you all can appreciate that and take to heart the lasting role that conservation plays for future generations. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation is separate from the geography. We are a small nonprofit organization whose mission involves championing a collaborative campaign to connect, protect, and restore the corridor, that physical geography. So we work with all sorts of partners across the state and internationally as well. And the goal here is to raise awareness, to align our efforts, to make sure that we're not missing pieces. So we try to identify gaps. We work with others to prioritize areas and to make sure that we save the pieces that are most at risk of being lost, and educate the public so that they understand those things on the journey. And it starts really with an appreciation for the aesthetic and developing an understanding of particular areas. So I want to begin with sharing a little bit about Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. It's an Audubon-owned property and managed property, and it's about 20 square miles in size, and it sits in Southwest Florida. And about 6 years ago, there was a woman that visited from out of state, paid her admission at the visitor center, and headed out on the boardwalk. And she ran into a volunteer who was walking against the grain on the boardwalk, and this volunteer encountered the woman and cautioned her not to go the long way. There's a shortcut on the boardwalk and a long route on the boardwalk. The long route's 2.25 miles. The short route's a mile. And he said that there's a male panther on the boardwalk, and you might want to avoid that. So when you get to the shortcut, just take that. Now, this woman did what perhaps all of us here today would have done. She gets her iPhone out and she's ready and she's waiting to see perhaps if she could get a glimpse of this panther and capture it on her video screen. And I know about this because she did capture a panther and she did share it online, and the video went viral. If you haven't seen it, I would take a look. Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary Panther on the boardwalk. I'm sure you'll get some hits there to take you to the video. But looking through her camera lens, you see her entering into the cypress forest, and it's fairly shady in there in the cypress, nice and cool. And this panther comes around the corner, and this was March of the year. The water levels were lowering, and it was a pretty dry swamp at the time. And the cat's on the boardwalk, and you can hear the cat's foot padding on the wood, and you can see the cat see her and the reaction the cat has. And there's looks like a moment of hesitation, and the cat starts to pick up speed, and it glances side to side, and it doesn't know what to do, and it races past her, and she somehow miraculously keeps the cat in frame as it goes by her on this narrow 5-foot wide boardwalk, and you can hear the claws scratching on the boardwalk, and the experience that this woman has just really comes through, and you just can't believe this happened. I was director at the time, and the video went viral, and millions of people across the globe were watching this cat on Corkscrew's boardwalk. And for the next 2 months, now in March, most of the snowbirds have gone home, and usually visitation at an ecotourism place in Southwest Florida swamps is a trickle at that point. But this was the best April and May that the sanctuary had ever had, as people heard about this and got excited about the possibility of seeing a rare Florida panther. And as the sanctuary director at the time, I would engage people that were coming in and hear them talk about these cats and their enthusiasm. Will we see it? And it was palpable, the excitement that people had for just the possibility of maybe seeing a Florida panther. And if we extrapolate that, here's this cat. I began to ask, this wasn't the exact same cat, this is a different cat out at Corkscrew, but people were hoping to see this, and I would engage them in conversations to find out what they knew about Florida panthers and about conservation and the efforts needed to save them. And I would ask them, how many panthers do you think you can accommodate here at Corkscrew Swamp? And reminding them that the boardwalk covers about 800 acres. When you walk that boardwalk, you're looking at about 1/15 of the full size of the sanctuary. And of course, for most people, this seems like a massive area. And in their minds, they're thinking, well, this is huge. These panthers surely can do just fine here. And I would get numbers of, you could probably have 10 panthers here, 20 panthers. So people's imaginations and their lack of understanding of the scale of a male panther's home range was confronted with reality. And I would let them know that this little boardwalk and this little sanctuary, though it's 20 square miles, is really 1/10 of what you would need to protect if you want to satisfy the home range needs of a dominant male Florida panther. Because that dominant male is going to run any other male panther out of the territory, and then they'll have to find somewhere else to go. So if we want to save one male panther, you need 10 corkscrews. If you want to save a population, you need much more than that. So the conservation story there becomes quite daunting. And it was exciting to me to have these conversations with people and bust some of the assumptions that they have, and start talking about looking across the fence line, looking over your property boundaries, and seeing how the wildlife uses the landscape. How is our conservation puzzle connected? Are our boundaries permeable? Are they safe? Are they protected? Can cats go from one place to another? And ultimately, for many in the public, the question becomes, why does it matter? Why is it important? So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that why. Why do we try to work on a large landscape scale conservation message? And how does it benefit not just the people like me who love panthers for the panthers' sake, but also people who maybe wouldn't go out of their way to go see a Florida panther? And so we take a look at Southwest Florida, and we take a look at the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. And if you can see my cursor here, this is the CREW watershed, the Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed. And the dark green areas are areas that are already conserved and in some kind of conservation protection. And the light green areas are areas that are not protected. Down here in the lower right of this area, you have the Big Cypress National Preserve and you have the Florida Panther Preserve. And so you've got a lot of light green between the Corkscrew and these big federal and state properties. Up here to the northeast, you have the Ocala-Ocoochee Slough Wildlife Management Area, Dinner Island Wildlife Management Area, and Spirit of the Wild Wildlife Management Areas. So you have another light green connection, a narrow corridor between those. So we bring this picture up because it's important for people to realize that this collection of state and private conservation lands in the Corkscrew watershed are dependent upon unprotected connections. So if we want to have wildlife like panthers and black bears include the Corkscrew in their home range, then we need to maintain those connections. That's a part of that Florida Wildlife Corridor puzzle. And this isn't just important for those panthers and those black bears. As I mentioned, that one sighting of that panther inspired thousands of people to make an April and May trip to Corkscrew Swamp. And those people stopped at gas stations and local restaurants and stayed in hotels and visited the beaches and did shopping. This was an important driver for the economy locally and for the quality of life as well. I know many people who are volunteers at Corkscrew for whom just love donating their time and spending time in nature. And there are people who are members, annual pass members, that some people come daily to the sanctuary to experience those trails, and it improves their quality of life. But if you take a look at the watershed as well, we talked about this being part of the Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed. The wetlands at the headwaters of the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary feed several rivers and creeks that flow down to the Gulf. And those are important for swimmable coasts, for the beaches, for people who kayak and paddle, for the folks who like to do fishing along the shore. So this watershed and the protection, not just for panthers and bears, but for the entire coastal economy is critical. And I mention this because this isn't just a Southwest Florida issue. This is the same kinds of issues that benefit people all over the state, whether we're talking about a state park or a national park, a forest, river, spring, wetland, or trail. There are so many places throughout our state which are dependent upon connectivity and having habitat that is connected to the larger areas like that. If we lose these connections, these light green connections, then you will lose some of those panther sightings. Eventually, after a generation or two, panthers will stop finding their way to Corkscrew Swamp. And you'll start to see less enthusiasm, no more viral videos from people encountering panthers on the boardwalk. And that then will trickle down into the local economy. So one of the things we keep in mind at the Florida Wildlife Corridor is that networks of connected and protected areas are inherently more resilient than individual isolated patches, whether it's a storm, whether it's a flood event, prescribed fires, natural fires. There are disruptions in the ecosystem that can sever connections. And so the idea here for us is to look statewide at this big Florida Wildlife Corridor boundary and see what areas are protected and what areas need protection. And I want to just dig in a little bit more to what that looks like. The Florida Wildlife Corridor is 18 million acres. Approximately 10 million acres are already protected. I think it's important to note that we've been collectively, we've been protecting land for over 100 years. The first piece of conservation property that I'm aware of being purchased in Florida was the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge well over 100 years ago. So we've been investing taxpayer dollars and private dollars for 100 years to conserve special places. And we have a tremendous portfolio of amazing conservation areas throughout the state, over 10 million acres of it. And when you take a look at that, what we see in those state parks and state forests and springs and blueways, what we see there in terms of wildlife and water quality and habitat is a result of the fact that it's still connected. And those connections, the most important of those connections, represent this 8 million acre light green unprotected footprint. We look at that as our opportunity area. Those are the areas that we need to solve parts of this conservation puzzle to make sure that we don't have degradation occur throughout the state that not only affects wildlife, but again, affects our quality of life and affects our local economies. And you take a look too at the geometry. It's not just a matter of acres. If you take a look at the way those acres are laid out on the map, there are some areas that are very, very narrow. These are bottlenecks. Any area of the corridor that's less than a mile wide is a bottleneck area, and it's more vulnerable to fragmentation than larger, wider expanses where you have an opportunity to create a couple of connecting routes. But some of these narrow areas, you've got one shot. And if you lose that bottleneck area, then you've created cul-de-sacs in some of the high quality patches. So we need to know it, we need to understand it, and then we also need to figure out what the value is. When you take a look at the corridor, what it's constituted with, you have 1,700 miles of paddling trails throughout the Florida Wildlife Corridor. There are 171 magnitude 1 and magnitude 2 springs throughout the corridor, 6,300 miles of hiking trails, and that includes 1,100 miles of the Florida National Scenic Trail. You all probably have your favorite trails and your favorite places to take family when they come and visit, your favorite state parks. There are 75 state parks that are connected within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. You may already know we have 175 state parks in Florida. One way of looking at that is there are already 100 parks that are not connected to the Florida Wildlife Corridor. They don't have the benefit of those kinds of connections. There are 75 that are still in it, still connected, and it would be in the public's best interest to maintain those connections. Same thing with our state forests. Now, when you take a look at what makes up that the opportunity area, most of the opportunity area are working lands, and those include ranches and working forests, timberlands. So there are 7 million acres of working lands within the corridor, and this isn't something that we're going to solve by fee simple purchase of 7 million acres of working lands to put in public ownership. Conservation easements must be a way forward for us if we're going to make these connections. So we work with agencies and organizations to make sure that we can still have a good and healthy working lands landscape, not just for the wildlife, but also for local economies. It's important for food and fiber and the local workforce. I'll touch on that a little bit more as we go along. Now, one of the ways our organization invests in communities and in the corridor and helping solve problems is through expeditions. And each of our expeditions has resulted in a documentary video. Now, our first two documentary videos were long efforts, 1,000 miles in 100 days there in 2012 on Everglades to Okefenokee. And the main purpose for that was to show the state that there was, in fact, a connected corridor going through private and public lands all the way from Everglades to Georgia. And that was a massive undertaking, and I believe really started a movement here. And that was before we were officially an organization. In 2015, another 1,000-mile journey took place from the headwaters of the Everglades all the way up to Alabama, which was called the Forgotten Coast film. And after those two long efforts, we started to dig deeper into some focal areas around the state and spend time getting to know communities and understanding the complexities of the conservation puzzle in those locations. And so our most recent three expeditions have been short ventures, and you can see the maps, the paths of those expeditions on the screen. And if you want to visit the WEDU website, WEDU has a page with all of our films streaming on them, so you can watch our expedition films and get to know a little deeper some of these areas. And the 2018 film called The Last Green Thread, the films shown there in the middle of the screen. That film went from the Disney Wilderness Preserve, headwaters of the Everglades, through a very narrow area that was quite heavily developed in certain places, underneath I-4, and from Osceola to Orange to Polk to Lake County, ending up in the Green Swamp. And it showcased one of the most narrow, most fragile areas within the corridor. And it's an area that we've long hoped to improve the permeability, because there are some roads that go through there that could use some wildlife crossings. And there are some areas there that are still in open green space that the fate of them is not yet determined. And so one of the things we do when we do these expeditions is we introduce ourselves to the local decision makers and the nonprofit organizations, and just try to keep tabs on how things are going, and where we can, we work on solutions that would be mutually beneficial to all the parties possible in trying to pursue connections. So we're still working on that last spring thread corridor. The next expedition was the Wild Divide, and this one wove from Highlands Hammock State Park up through a series of ranch lands across US 27 on the Lake Wales Ridge, and into Mitigation Bank and several state-owned properties, ending up with TNC's Tiger Creek Preserve, which was just a wonderful bookends, state to private property, going through working lands and getting to know some of the ranchers who have for multiple generations been stewards of the landscape and sharing their habitat with black bears and panthers. So that was a wonderful opportunity to see the communities and get to know some of the players, and have conversations with the Florida Department of Transportation on plans for putting in wildlife crossings under US 27 as they widen the road, and understanding what that could mean, not just for black bears and panthers, but also for the safety of drivers on those roads. We departed, I guess before I jump there, I'll just mention the last two films. Home Waters is the most recent film that we did, and that was a departure from our previous 4 films, in that it featured 3 teenage girls as our trekkers. They were the superstars of this film, and have since become ambassadors for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, as we took them from the Rainbow River down, from Rainbow Springs down the Rainbow River to the Withlacoochee and out to the Gulf. And this was a tremendous way to highlight the Denellen Gap and some of the resources around Marion, Levy, and Citrus counties that are really important for the Florida Wildlife Corridor in that Nature Coast area. And we followed that up with a community mural, and you can see some of the students from Lecanto High School painting on that mural there. So we try to celebrate the Florida Wildlife Corridor and draw attention to it in ways that benefit the community. So this is just one of those examples. And we also, in 2021, partnered with National Geographic and WildPath, Carlton Ward's organization, to help create this Saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which focused a bit more on the economic implications of the corridor and looking at working lands, the timber industry and ranching, ecotourism, oyster fishing, and airboat captains and recreational fishing as well, to show that economic side and the benefits of protecting a corridor. That Home Waters expedition from the Rainbow River to the Gulf is one that we're now traveling around the state and doing some screenings, and before too long that one will be available to everybody to take a look at. Again, focusing on young people and hoping to inspire the next generation of conservationists. And one of the focuses of the Florida Wildlife Corridor effort is to engage communities within the corridor, and that starts, of course, with the people, and getting an understanding of who uses the corridor and how do they use it, where does it benefit them and their quality of life, and how do they rely on that, and go from there and see what resources there are and what people value, and merging that together with our understanding of the wildlife and the needs of the wildlife, and how the wildlife engages in the habitat, where the strong links are in conserved areas and where the weak and fragile points are as well. So we work with people, wildlife, and habitat. And I'm just going to show you a few of the beautiful images, most of them taken by Carlton Ward. associated with many of our expeditions. We've made an effort over the past couple of years to do a better job elevating the connection between the aquatic portions of the corridor and the terrestrial. I believe that the first thing that comes to mind when people think about wildlife corridors is the black bears and panthers. And while that's true, there's also really strong and important critical connections for wildlife and for our state related to the water. So focusing on manatees and snook, small-toothed sawfish is also important, as are birds in the corridor. And often overlooked are the pathways for migratory and non-migratory species. Red-cockaded woodpeckers are great ambassadors for land management and stewardship of our forests and the future of populations of this threatened species. Thornetary warblers eating some cypress looper caterpillars. We'll talk a little bit more about that here. Aldo Leopold said to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And I had a group of college students from Florida Gulf Coast University out on Corkscrew's boardwalk on a tour. And while we were out there, we were looking at a mixed flock of warblers feeding on something in the cypress. And I was pointing out these warblers to folks. One of the students asked me what this granular substance was on the boardwalk railing. And I took a look at that and just stopped for a second and asked them all to listen. Could they hear that pattering sound that was evident in the forest around them? And of course they could. It sounded like rain falling on a tarp. And I told them that that's frass. And they nodded their heads, and someone said, okay. And they were, most of them, satisfied. But one person took a moment and asked a follow-up question. What is frass? And I had a hat on, by the way, but none of them did. Most of them didn't. And I explained to them that there were caterpillars, these cypress looper caterpillars, in the cypress trees at that moment, feeding on the leaves. And what you're hearing is caterpillar droppings. Frass is caterpillar poop, and the grains you're seeing and the sound you're hearing is caterpillar poop that's fallen on the boardwalk and on you. And there were evident gasps and groans and people covering their heads trying to get away from this frass. And so that was a teachable moment right there. First of all, come prepared. I should have probably told them to wear hats. But the reality here is this was an opportunity to tell them that, yes, maybe you don't want to have a hatless walk through a caterpillar-laden forest, but these are critical components of the ecosystem. The caterpillars feed on the cypress leaves, and the migratory warblers come in and feed on the caterpillars and helps fuel their migration to Central and South America. It's a really critical part. These cypress looper caterpillars also happen to be the only host for a parasitic wasp called Coleoctonumon navis, which lays its eggs in the wasp, and that egg matures, or I'm sorry, lays the egg in the caterpillar, and the egg matures into a moth, and that's an important pollinator for I should say that the egg matures into the wasp, and the wasp is an important pollinator for many of our native flowers in the wetlands in Florida. So those links in the ecological machinery are very important, and many people just expect that we scientists understand all of it, and we don't. It's very complex. So we have to make sure that when we tinker in our ecosystem, that we don't ignore the connections, because when we pick up one thing, we find out that it's hitched to a whole lot of other things, as John Muir once pointed out. And that takes us to the drivers and understanding and the importance of science in conservation. In 1848, Buckingham Smith was commissioned by the Treasury Secretary of the U.S. to go down and do a reconnaissance in South Florida to answer two questions. Can we physically drain the Everglades? And if we can, should we do it? And Buckingham Smith writes a report back to Congress the next year, and he describes this in the opening pages of the report, this beautiful area, talking about how it's this profound and wild solitude of the place, the solemn silence that pervades it, add to awakened and excited curiosity, feelings bordering on awe. Now, knowing the end of the story, I was surprised to read this from Buckingham Smith, someone who appreciated the aesthetic beauty of South Florida and the Everglades. Reading this report, flipping a few other pages, this jumped out at me. This was a change in the direction of his writing. I see, but the practical man. And he goes on to say, but the practical man, the Everglades are now suitable only for the haunt of noxious vermin or the resort of pestilent reptiles. The statesmen whose exertions shall cause the millions of acres they contain now worse than worthless, to teem with the products of agricultural industry, to be changed into a garden in which can be reared many and various exotics. That man will merit a high place in public favor, not only with his own generation, but with posterity. Now, Buckingham Smith was, this was not tongue-in-cheek. There was no malice in this. He genuinely believed that the right thing to do was to drain the Everglades and to make it suitable for development and crops and so forth, and thought that it would benefit our country. But there were pieces he didn't understand. And as time went by, we recognized as science and our understanding of the ecosystem down there caught up, we realized we need to restore the Everglades and we need to try to put it back. So we've been spending the last few decades trying to figure out how to get some measure of the function back. That should be a cautionary tale for us. As we look at the green space in the rest of the state, what are the things that we can do now as we grow and as we develop that can keep us from finding out a generation from now that we need to restore it? And we need to go back and try and repair it, because the cost will be much higher in trying to put the system back. Let's do what we can to get it right the first time. And despite the fact that we can easily appreciate the beauty of something, if we don't have a thorough knowledge of it, if we haven't invested in the science of it, if we're not using the science to guide our decisions, we can think that we love it. We can make decisions that are contrary or counter to the overall benefits of our community and of future generations. So this Da Vinci quote, I think, is one that for me resonates and helps to drive what I do. So back to the big picture of this statewide corridor. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation cannot be in all 67 counties, taking a look at what's happening and being involved there. But we don't have to be, because there are agencies and nonprofit organizations and private citizens who use and work in and watch over and steward the landscape around us, and they're helping to save and preserve this. A lot of them doing so much heavy lifting, and some of those examples would be the Division of State Lands in the Florida Forever Land Acquisition Program, or the Rural Land Stewardship Protection Plan, the Office of Greenways and Trails, and the Trail Town program that they are working on. What we're trying to do is partner with folks and identify what are the places where we need to spend our time and energy. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that this isn't new. Larry Harris and Reed Noss back in the mid-'80s came up with this idea, advancing the understanding of ecosystems and landscape conservation, and coming up with a reserve network for Florida way back in the mid-'80s. This reserve network looks an awful lot like the Florida Ecological Greenways Network model, which Tom Hochter has helped to advance and refresh every few years. And these things are the basis of the Florida Wildlife Corridor boundary. It's this hard science recognizing the core areas of benefit and ecological value that are in the state, and the connections that preserve those values. So that's where we're operating from. It's a science-based approach, looking at what are the best and most important areas to protect. Now, there are some counties that don't have a lot of Florida Wildlife Corridor that's not already protected. There are some counties like Pasco that have already protected most of their Florida Wildlife Corridor footprint, but they still have some important ecological connections in the priority 4 and priority 5 layers of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. So there are plans in place. If you're a county and you're involved in county conservation and you want to continue to advance land acquisition in your area, there are ways to do that. But if you are in a county that has Florida Wildlife Corridor footprint in there, that's a great place to start. And it's not just opinion, it's based on science and modeling. So we would encourage you to look at that. Another thing too is to get connected to people like Dan Smith and Tom Hochter and our FWC biologists to understand what kinds of corridors might be important, whether it's a corridor that would be considered a commuter corridor used daily by wildlife, or if it's a dispersal corridor that's something that a black bear might use, like M34, which is one of the famous bears that kind of inspired the Florida Wildlife Corridor effort. That's a bear that was a young 2-year-old bear, part of Joe Guthrie's studies, captured not too far from the Avon Park Air Force Range, that went on a 2-month, more than 500-mile walkabout, dispersing. This young bear was leaving its natal grounds, looking for a new home range for it to spend its life in. And it went north from that Avon Park Air Force Range area and bumped into I-4. And it spent about 4 days not able to cross I-4 and continue north before finally turning south and going all the way back to the western edge of Lake Okeechobee before eventually its collar fell off. But M34 was a dispersing bear doing a one-way movement, looking for a new home range. And that bear represents a package of genes that could go from a healthy bear population, like the Highlands Glades bear population that it came from, and had it used that 500-mile journey and had it made it across I-4, it could have theoretically gotten to a place in the Chassahowitzka area or the Nature Coast where its genes could have contributed to an area that's relatively isolated from a bear's perspective. So one of the goals that we have at the Florida Wildlife Corridor is to look at populations and to work with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission to see where we can connect populations of wildlife in meaningful ways, not to send super highways of black bears through communities, but to accommodate bears like M34 that have a meaningful genetic contribution that could be made to another population. And if we're going to do this, again, we have to make sure that as we grow as a state, we're growing in places that we can afford to put more homes and roads. And if we have roads going in an area that is through the corridor, we need to elevate those roads. So we need to work with the people and the organizations that build infrastructure. That's one of the things I'm excited to see is the FDOT and the CFX throughout the state, looking at the footprint of their infrastructure, whether it's a new build or whether it's a widening of lanes, and being willing to consider putting in wildlife corridors in places to connect these habitats. And that will allow us to buck the trend and meet with that alternative there on the right side, where we still have room for 33 million people in 2070, but we also have room for the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So that's our goal. And as we do this, again, keeping in mind these red, narrow bottleneck areas need to be on our radar, not just at the state level, but also at the local level. Counties and municipalities have an opportunity here to be heroes. It's not just a matter of delegating a state agency to do this, but there's an opportunity for counties and municipalities to get involved. It's also important that we continue to increase and sustain high levels of funding for our land acquisition programs like Florida Forever and Rural and Family Lands. I've been encouraged to see over the course of the last year more landowners applying for both of those programs. And that's going to mean continuing to support those Division of State Lands and the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services funding for those programs so that they can actually execute those land deals. And also programs like the Office of Greenways and Trails Trail Town program. That's a phenomenal program. Recognizing communities that have ecotourism and have an image that is consistent with trails, outdoor recreation, and nature, and encouraging them and helping them to attract attention and visitation from folks to help support their economy. Because economy is a really big part of the long-term vision for the corridor. If we don't recognize that local economies need the corridor and the corridor benefits them, then we won't save it. So we commissioned an economic study a little over a year ago, and that study showed that the Florida Wildlife Corridor footprint has an annual return economically of about $30 billion. And it supports 114,000 jobs within the corridor. And that's an important thing to consider. So when you go into a place like Crystal River, who has a nature-based economy, that whether it's the springs or manatee tours and trips and all the associated excitement around those activities, that those economies really depend on clean water, good flows into the springs, and connected landscapes. So we look at that and try to partner with folks like Archbold and TNC and Audubon, as well as the agencies to look out and protect the corridor. And we also work with those who are designing and developing communities. There are ways that you can create a community that accommodates connectivity. There are ways to preserve some green paths through communities and use your green space allocations for these purposes. But it's also important that we share with folks, we're not creating pathways where none exist. We're protecting the ones that are already there. So this is not an effort to route wildlife through a community, but it's to preserve the areas the wildlife are already or naturally would use, and prevent the fragmentation of those existing pathways. So those animals that normally would have gone on a one-way trip through a property don't end up on a road and having an impact with traffic or finding themselves lost in a community and creating some kind of an attractive nuisance there. So we're thrilled whenever we see the FDOT starting to do some of these builds on wildlife crossings. The Wekiva Parkway has some amazing bridging. This crossing here right by State Road 5 or County Road 557 on I-4, a little bit west of Orlando, is going to be done this coming summer. Should be done around June. And if you're driving that way, you can keep a lookout for the construction in progress. It's going to link two wildlife management areas that have been severed for 50 years. So it's a point to make that even if we have fragmentation that occurs, so long as it's not neighborhoods on either side of that road, there will be an opportunity to reinvest in a structure that can make that roadway permeable to wildlife. And that's not only good for the wildlife, but it's also good for the people. And I am just about to wrap up, but I wanted to leave you with a Wendell Berry quote. "The world is not given by our fathers, but borrowed from our children. We should come to cherish it and do it no damage, not because we are duty bound, but because we love the world and we love our children." And if you haven't already found us on social media and you want to, there's a few of the ways to connect with us. If you want to get involved or find out more about our organization and what we're doing, you can just visit our website, or you can email us at info@, or my own email address, which is jason@floridawildlifecorridor.org. That's it. I think I left some time for questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all that information and those stories from your own experience working in these different conservation areas. We do want to open it up for questions now, so please feel free to put your questions in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and speak. We do have a question to get started with here, which Jason may not have had a chance to touch on, but feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go. Can you talk a little bit about the Florida Wildlife Corridor Summit, since we do have a lot of people here that are professionals in outdoor recreation that might be interested in attending, and what people can take away if they do go to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did our first large summit last year in April, and one of the goals there was to try to get some participation from the organizations that were in conservation and those that were involved in tourism and development, and have a conversation about the importance of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We were thrilled to see the level of participation we had from the agencies. We really would like to get more people in the chambers of commerce sector, the development sector, the restaurant and lodging sector, because we recognize, again, the economy piece is really important. So our next summit is going to be in the Orlando area in late September. If you want to visit our website, you're welcome to see that page, and you can keep tabs on that as we go. And we're looking for a similar makeup, but we again hope to get more people involved in the economic side of that picture. And we'll have keynote speakers, and there'll be some elements, of course, that were similar to the last summit, but this time we're also planning on working in some conservation roundtable discussions that might have a more curated feel to them, to try to really get some work done as well. We've since the first summit, we've convened 5 different working groups tackling specific problems within the corridor that were elevated, and we have quite a bit of partnering going on in those. So we'll report out from those 5 working groups and hopefully advance the work streams that each of those are doing as well. Hopefully that was enough of an answer, but if not, please shoot me an email.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a really good overview. Thank you. We do have a question in the chat here. This effort is receiving a wide range of political support. What are the keys to achieving this, and how does funding look for 2023?
Yeah, thanks, Doug. We're thrilled with the support, and this so far. One of the reasons why I think this has gotten as much support as it has is it's voluntary, inspirational, and visionary. It's not regulatory. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Act of 2021 established the value of the corridor and put some goals out, and the FDP was directed to encourage landowners and agencies and organizations for funding and for collaboration. And so it's all been from that positive, forward-looking, proactive, solutions-oriented approach. And I think that's why it's received as much support as it has. And we've had significant funding in the tune of $300 million last year and the year before that. I should say that the funding for this year, 2023, for the Rural and Family Lands is going to kick in January 1st. So we're really looking forward to seeing that, and seeing the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to start working on additional conservation easements.
Great. You can see here we have a couple more questions. Please tell everyone about Accelerating Connections Grant Program and where things stand with announcing the awards.
Yeah, thank you, Harold, for that question. We announced at the last summit that we were launching a grant program called Accelerating Connections, and the idea there was to get some creative, innovative ideas out that would solve some of the more difficult problems in the corridor. And one of the maps that I shared in the presentation had some red spots. It was hot spots and bottlenecks. Those are some of those areas that don't necessarily look like your typical Florida Forever or Rural and Family Lands acquisition. And they probably won't fit that mold. So that might be something that requires a different approach. So the Accelerating Connections Grant Program was meant to put some energy into that. And starting early in next year, we will be announcing the winner for that award. So thanks, Harold.
Great. We still have a couple minutes here, so if anyone else does have another question, feel free to speak up. The next question is, do other states have wildlife corridors, and did Florida draw inspiration from another successful program in the country?
There are other corridors in other states and globally, and it's perhaps some of the most inspiring ones to us personally have been some that have been in Africa. There's the Okavango Delta project that is absolutely inspiring. It's been a place that captured my imagination when I was a kid, and to see those kinds of multi-country efforts being undertaken let us know as an organization that this is possible. The other corridor efforts that are there's one that's from Yukon to Yellowstone, which is across the Canadian border, which is another inspiration. And we certainly do take a look at those programs and see how they're working out. And parts of the Florida Wildlife Corridor can borrow from that, and there are some parts that just don't look like that. And you have to go to Europe, and some of the Greenbelt projects that are in Europe that are going through more developed community footprints to find parallels. But absolutely, we aren't the first corridor, but I would say we're in the lead in terms of in the U.S. In terms of making some progress, and it's great to have the support of so many amazing partners.
Great, that's awesome to hear. The next question from Michael here is, how can conservation programs like the Land Acquisition Trust Fund complement other programs you mentioned, like the Florida Forever and the Rural and Family Lands, to realizing the Florida Wildlife Corridor?
Yeah, Rural and Family Lands and Florida Forever and the Florida Communities Trust, they have targets and a scope. They're built to address particular kinds of conservation needs. And they're fantastic. I would love to see Florida Communities Trust, by the way, have some robust funding in the coming year, because that program is sort of a partnership between some local governments and can address some of these areas that aren't typically done by Florida Forever or Rural and Family. I have heard that the Division of State Lands is working on a mega parcel kind of approach, which may address some of those areas too. So that's kind of an innovative look into helping conserve some of the gaps. So those programs are phenomenal, and the conservation easements that Rural and Family Lands and Florida Forever offer are a little different, have a different approach. So landowners may decide they fit better in one versus the other, but they're both useful programs that deserve support and continued funding. I'd also add, though, that several counties had land acquisition programs on the ballot this past November, and a few other counties have had long-term land acquisition programs at the county level that provides local dollars to decision makers to address issues. Because with 67 counties and 8 million opportunity acres, it's not possible to expect the state governments to address every conservation need. And if a problem comes up locally, it's really important for those local counties to have the funding at their fingertips to make sure that their natural resource areas that are priorities for them are also protected. So I love seeing that increased interest in counties to participate in protecting the corridor. And I'm hopeful that kind of a trend will continue.
All right. Well, seeing as I think we've got all of our questions answered here, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. Thank you, Jason, so much again for joining us and your great presentation. Thanks to everyone here with us that joined in today. As I mentioned, we are going to be sending out a recording of this, so check your emails for that. You can also answer a survey telling us what you want to hear next about in the webinar series. And we are excited to share that our signups are available now for our 2023 webinars. So we have the first 5 months of that posted on our website. You can go ahead and sign up for that as well. If you have any questions about this webinar or future webinars, feel free to reach us at the Office of Greenways and Trails at floridadep.gov. And with that, we are going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again to Jason.
Thanks, everyone, for showing up. Appreciate it.